So you and I have had the good fortune of being together in physical space, I think three or four different times, three times, I think. And I think from the very first conversation, you asked to record that conversation. And that's happened most of the times that I've been with you. And I know that this is a thing that you do. And I would love to hear from you why you started recording conversations, because I think one, it's really interesting as a practice in itself, but it's also kind of like in a weird way the like lineage of this podcast is like, oh, if I'm going to have interesting conversations with
Hmm.
people, I should record them anyway. So I would love to hear from you about that and why you started doing it and what it's been like and all of that stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's yeah. I can see why that question's a good starting point. Um, so and I'm a little bit amused at like I'm amused at it as a starting point as well because there's quite a number of recordings that I have with people, particularly in the very first conversation in which we were recording or perhaps even meeting. There's a lot of conversations that I have with people where the uh the first part of the conversation is about how we're recording conversations. So, it's
Totally.
like um they're like, sure, and then they're like, what's the deal with that anyway? And I'm like, well, so um yeah, so this practice emerged in the culture incubator that I spent the better part of the last decade living at, in Waterloo, which has been known by various names. Uh, Upstart Collaboratory for Collaborative Culture Design being kind of one of the longest running names, and more recently the Liminal Space Agency. And we started doing this in 2016. Well, prior to that, we'd been recording our meetings. Like, we would have a kind of weekly meeting that was this group practicing and talking about this new culture. But as we started to take things more seriously, particularly those of us who are living there, we began recording pretty much all of our conversations, and the all of themness came from how often we'd get halfway through a conversation, realize something really juicy was happening, and be like, "Oh, are we recording this?" And so eventually, we just started having a really strong default to just recording everything. Um, the mere act of recording a conversation changes it. Even if you don't end up doing anything with the recordings, it gives a different feel to the a few different dimensions of what's present. Like, there's the sense of awareness that other people might hear what you're saying, who don't have the context that the people that you're like that are live in the conversation have, and so that can create some different kinds of like contextual awareness. um, but in terms of the main reason why we started, it was that we were noticing that in terms of the group coherence that we were looking for, it made a huge difference to be able to uh, basically fully like give people a full experience of conversations they weren't in. And there's kind of a few reasons why that um why that was powerful. So one of them is, um just if something important happened, somebody had a major insight or a learning or some sort of cool exchange happened, we could, share that in full fidelity with people. um there was also like the experience of like re-listening to yourself, like, and being able to notice like, oh yeah, that was the point in the conversation when I suddenly got really angry. Like, what was going on for me there? And like, why did, you could basically use them therapeutically. And in the coherence therapy work I've done the last year with a therapist, we've we've used a kind of just memory based technique called rewind, where you just like you go into the situation where you had some trigger come up or whatever, and you just try to rewind the tape until right before the trigger, and you kind of, and so I've had experiences in of listening. Already it's occurring to me, I've had experiences of listening to recordings and literally re-listening to a particular minute like multiple times to be like, what was going on there for me, and like, what do I think was going on there for this other person? Like, so that's really cool. And then another big piece is basically I'm going to say something really obvious, which is you don't know what it's like when you're not there. Like you don't know what a conversation's like when you're not in it. And this is more obviously true for somebody as loud and boisterous as I am. But even in general, like you don't know what how people talk when you're not in the room. I've never been in a conversation of all women. I can't be. It wouldn't be a conversation of all women if I were. Um, but to have the experience of being able to witness those conversations, not just among, actors on TV, but among the very people that you're usually in conversation with, can be very powerful. You can notice the moments when, I mean, for me, for instance, it's very, very obvious when I'm listening to a recording and there's a moment when, like, if I were sitting there, like I almost certainly would have like jumped in with some comment, but I'm not there, so I didn't. And then like I get to find out what happens when I don't. Um so oh, and I guess, yeah, so those are a bunch of reasons. And I guess the fourth reason I would point at is it can be a cool way for people to meet each other. Um this has sometimes been fraught, and I mean we can talk more about some of the tensions that have arisen around recordings and so on, as well. Um but when it's been good, it's been really cool. Like, one of the people who's involved with the project now, I met him 3 years ago, um right around the time I met you, I guess, actually. Like we first, yeah, because we first hung out in the Bay Area when I was there. And so we recorded, a chunk of our conversation where he had heard about, the group I was part of, and was asking about it. And I said, let's record, and we recorded it and sent it back, you know to the um to the group, and they kind of, transcribed it and reflected on it. And it was the conversation was in part about how he was interested in joining the thing. And that was such a powerful introduction. Like, I didn't have to say, hey guys, there's this guy who, and like try to tell them about him and try to explain why I thought he resonated with our, views and stuff like that, and possibility spaces. I could just give a live demo of, like, yeah, here's us talking, and going into, you know these different angles. So that was really cool. And he's part of that project now. Like, he joined it over the course of the following year. And yeah.
So I had two questions for you when I first heard about this practice of recording things, which was, I guess it was coming from a place of like, this practice seems really cool, recording everything, but what does it actually take practically to do that? And one of the questions was sort of, how many of these conversations do you find yourself going back to, listening to again, transcribing, doing other things with, sharing with people, whatever it is that you might do with them? What sort of percentage did you find yourself going back to?
Yeah. It's hard to say in terms of a percentage, because I don't have that good of a sense of the total number of hours of recording that we would generate. And we were definitely recording more when I was in Waterloo. Well, in part because there were just more people, and so you could literally have a span of 3 hours where 5 hours of recordings were made, right? Because you'd have this group and that group both talking and separately recording, and then sometimes they'd share with each other and so forth. um and when we were there, we made a decent number of transcripts, and Otter helped in terms of doing like automatic transcripts. um but And then, with at the moment here with Sarah, who my partner, and with Eric, who was just recently on your podcast as well. We've been doing, we still record a substantial number of our conversations, but not kind of as many as were recorded in Waterloo. And and we also do less re-listening to them here. I mean, I think that's partially, there's a few reasons for that. One of them is that we've been working with just like a lot more logistical stuff in terms of what our day-to-day attention has been on. Like, we're currently moving, and so like we're having a bunch of conversations about furniture and stuff. And interesting cultural tidbits can come up in that, but it's less, it's low, way lower density, and so it's usually not worth listening to those. Um, but you know, like Sarah and I had a conversation a couple months ago about some of her vision for the future, and I was like, "Oh, Eric, like you definitely got to hear this. You know, this is important for cohering our sense of a vision of what we're doing." Um, oh, but then the other thing is like just because there's only three of us, it's it's somewhat less likely to get out of sync or get out of coherence without having enough, you know, that many recordings. Um, so that's part of it. But I mean, it is really interesting to consider the cases where things are transcribed. I realize I'm not answering your sort of percentage question very well. I would say probably liminal space agency would make transcripts per week in terms of like transcripts that they actively do any editing to, not just like throwing it into Otter, on the order of like 1 to 5 hours of conversation time worth of transcript per week, which is a fair bit. I mean, in terms of how long it takes to edit them. And then these would kind of, you know, get referenced and used for various things and commented on and stuff like that. And I mean, it can also, I didn't mention this when you're asking like what's the value of recording, but it can also just help to deepen your sense of what's happening, to like revisit like, oh yeah, this is this really important meeting we had a couple days ago. Like um it's very easy to lose touch with some breakthrough that you have. And without the recordings, you can almost feel a little bit crazy. Like, did that even happen? Like, were we really on the same page like a week ago? I thought we were on the same page about something, but like, if all you have is a bunch of people's different memories, I mean, that's the other thing that can be really cool. Like, unpacking misunderstandings. Like, you know, um, we once had a thing where I said something and then somebody else reflected back what they thought they heard me say, and it was the exact opposite. And we were like, wait, no, I definitely said blanc. And they're like, I definitely heard blanc. And it's like, that's one of those things where you really kind of have to agree to disagree if you don't have a recording. There's kind of like a, well, here's what I remember meaning to say, and the other person's like, well, here's the meaning I definitely got. And like, that's kind of, you're left with a deeply unknown objective truth about like what was said in fact. um but in one case in particular, we revisited it and we found that um what had happened was I had started a sentence and it had a negation in it. It's like, yeah, I'm sure that I'm not gonna blah 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 blah. And what I had done was I had tried to sort of cut and edit my sentence midway, but I hadn't properly indicated that what followed was supposed to not be negated by the not
Mm-hmm.
or
Mm-hmm.
something.
Mm-hmm.
And so it made total sense in retrospect that I had thought that I had clearly said one thing and somebody else had thought that I'd clearly said the opposite. Like when we re-listened to it, it was like, it was such a powerful experience of this sort of interpersonal parallax of like seeing like, wow, your perspective makes sense and my perspective makes sense. Like they both made a lot of sense, you know. And we could revisit the data in order to see that.
Hmm. When I first talked to you about it, and also now, I got sort of a sense of like a principle that if you record your conversations, that you can't know in advance which conversations are going to be important, but if you record it, you're just going to have it recorded, and it might be extremely useful in the future to have it recorded. Does that seem fair to describe your experience of that?
Totally, yeah. And so it's to be expected that a large fraction of them don't end up getting used.
Mhm.
That's kind of necessary in order to get a large fraction of the ones that do need to be used, because you can't know in advance. I mean, you can sometimes know in advance, like that a conversation is more or less likely. And there's obviously conversations where it's sort of like, you know, it's going to be historical, right? Like in some way, like, you know, these people meeting for the first time or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, but but yeah, one important caveat, because people have been confused about this before, is that the culture there is not like Bridgewater's. So Bridgewater is, I guess, a hedge fund or something like that, some investment company that has itself a really interesting and weird culture, which was profiled in Robert Keegan's An Everyone Culture book. And they record all of their meetings. I don't think they record hallway conversations, which is itself interesting.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Right, like, but they record all of their meetings, and those recordings are, I guess, either automatically, or maybe they even have people hired to like transcribe them or whatever, and anyone who was mentioned in the meeting gets notified about that. So it's sort of,
Mhm.
in principle, there's no secrets. I think that is risky, like, in a certain sense. I mean, maybe fine in a sufficiently corporate context, maybe, but or by corporate, I don't actually mean corporate. Maybe fine in a sufficiently technical context. Um, but um, but no secrets, because if you don't actually have the psychological safety needed to have no secrets, and you try to impose no secrets, what you instead get is secrets,
Mm.
right? Like, you get people like actually in fact having secrets, but like sort of implying that they don't exist on a deeper level than is ordinarily done with secrets. um and that seems, I don't know, that seems stressful. And certainly um when doing kind of the sort of mm, collaborative culture research and development work that Liminal Space Agency has been doing, and that I'm doing now with Eric and Sarah. It's like, in doing that work, you kind of need to be able to have conversations with some person without immediately sharing it with the other person, because it's like that's part of how you can just even make sense of what what you're what experience you're having, right? Like, um other people might have like blind spots or frames that make it hard to speak to them about something that they're doing that's bothering you. um I've noticed that sometimes people become kind of stupefied when they try to tell somebody about, like, if one person's holding a really strong frame and the other person tries to like give them feedback, they'll end up feeling um dumb. And I mean dumb in both senses of the word, like unintelligent, but also mute. Like, it's just hard, because when you're trying to tell somebody something, you're implicitly modeling how are they going to receive it.
Mm.
And if somebody's got a blind spot about something, and you try to point at that something, then the act of modeling how they'll receive it makes you unable to think it.
Mm.
um and so there's something really important about being able to think kind of outside of that context with somebody else. Like, what is this thing going on with this person and this, thing they keep doing? And like, like, do you have that experience too? It's like, well, I see what you're pointing at, but I see it more like this. And you can kind of triangulate what's going on and get a sense of, um oh, I'm seeing something real here, which you wouldn't get if you tried to talk with the person themselves about it, because they'd be doing some frame thing that would make it hard to notice that you had a thing to say.
Mm.
um
Mm.
and that's everybody. Like, that's like, people do it to greater and lesser degrees, but like, this is true of everybody. That we all have blind spots. Um we all are hard to talk to about our blind spots.
Mm.
That's part of what makes them blind spots.
Mm. There's so much there that I could ask you about.
Mhm. And
And
that, I mean, and that starts to get into like non-naive trust dance type of stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Totally, totally. Um, Maybe just to begin, I want to make sure that I understood something correctly. You were sort of contrasting the culture of Liminal Space Agency to Bridgewater, and you're saying Bridgewater, all the meetings, at least like the group meetings, are public by default, and people are notified if they were spoken about. But what were you saying about the contrasts, that the way the culture is at Liminal Space Agency?
Right. So, um, I'm gonna riff on a tiny common error that you made in speaking about the Bridgewater thing.
Hmm.
In order to lay out a small framework that I have around, um, English is a very confused language with respect to one particular thing, which is that we have the word public and we have the word private, and we don't have a word for like neither,
Mm.
right? And you refer to the Bridgewater recordings being public, which they obviously aren't. They are
Right, right, right,
shared within Bridgewater. They
right.
are public.
Internally public or something like
Yeah,
that.
internally public or something. but even internally public doesn't cover something like some other um kind of tag of uh sharing concern. I'm trying, there's no word for it, right? But the thing that private is like you don't share it, and then public is like everybody has it. But what's the term for something that like you share with discretion when it makes sense to you, given all of the context and information that you have, including perhaps knowledge that somebody might want something relatively not shared with certain people, and they certainly wouldn't want it to become public, right? Like what there's no word for that, right? Which is problematic because sometimes people have assumptions that everything that's being said is in some sense private, and it's like, well, no, everything should definitely fall into the discretion bucket by default,
Hmm.
right? Because otherwise, and in fact, that's how people treat it on some level. Like you have to use your own discretion. You can't use anything else. What else would you use? Private is just a heuristic within which to strongly guide your own discretion. um and and the importance of respecting it, and respecting it 100% is very high. And so, if something is explicitly stated as private, it's like I'm going to strongly undermine somebody else's trust in me if I go and share that. um but when things are kind of more nebulous, it's like we need to rely on our discretion, and at that point the role of saying like, hey, I don't want this shared, is guiding somebody else's discretion, and trusting that since they do in fact have the power to share it, that they will want to respect what you've said about not wanting it shared. um like like calling it private doesn't magically force them to not share it anyway. And so there is necessarily a trust that's being relied on there. Anyway, this is all relevant to the actual question you were asking, not so it's not just a kind of, I mean, I have a little rant about this and I like doing my rant, um but it's not just about the sort of public private thing. It's about like, how are the recordings managed um in this kind of a culture incubator or whatever. And in general, within the group, there was kind of a culture of basically, um unless specifically tagged, the conversations were, um well, I guess, part of the question also is, how do you manage all of this?
Mhm.
And mostly we've just had them in Google Drive, which is the least worst bad option or something. Like it's really not great. One of the things that's not great about it is that, to just put on my like designer hat for a moment, like the hierarchy of visibility in Google Drive is reversed, which is to say, like, if you're shared on a folder, then you can see anything in that subfolder, right?
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
when it comes to groups, what you want is ever more nested like subgroups where those outside can't see
Mm.
things, right?
Mm.
Like that's how group based privacy actually works, and it's the opposite of the Google Drive hierarchy, where like everything in a thing is visible to everybody who can see the top level thing. So there's had to be a bunch of folders that aren't associated with each other on Google Drive because they capture the different membranes of who can see which recordings.
Mm.
um but anyway, so yeah, I mean, I would like to see a whole app that has like SoundCloud like commenting features, where you can just kind of comment on the point in the recording. But like at this point, that might as well be integrated with like transcript commenting features. And but Otter's not really made to organize the kind of volume of transcripts that we produce, or volume of recordings that we would produce. um it's it's just not, like, it just doesn't have the organizational features at all for anything like that. um I'm also kind of like holding out for some sort of like Otter Roam integration, where like you can specifically reference like in your Roam blocks like utterances from a conversation that got transcribed or something like that. That seems pretty cool. um but yeah, so basically, stuff would get uploaded to Google Drive. Stuff that seemed important to um keep private to a smaller group for whatever reason would, sometimes not get shared, or would just get shared directly if somebody needed access to it. Then there'd be subgroups that would kind of have different folders to them, whether that was like a working team on some particular project, or whether that was uh, I mean, the group had a kind of tendency to, like, at any given time there would be a core of 2 to 4 people, and I think it's now up to the full 6 people that are living there, which is pretty cool. But a subgroup of 2 to 4 people that had enough kind of group coherence to really think together effectively and not get kind of constantly caught up on distrust or um, other kinds of jankinesses. And so often that group at any given time would kind of have its own folder that stuff was going in, where they could be talking about and making sense of what's going on with this person who's also kind of in the scene but not in this core group, who's having these whatever difficulties, and they would want the capacity to sort of do that sense making without immediately sharing it with the peer person that they're trying to make sense of. So but yeah, I mean, there's a lot of complex stuff to navigate there in terms of like inclusion and exclusion dynamics and all sorts of stuff. But I would say in general, the recordings probably help with that, because even if you're not in a conversation, there's a chance that like later you can go and hear it and comment on it even. There's one last cool thing that I'll just say about the power of recordings, which is power that you also, for the most part, get with fish bowling, which is to say somebody like listening to a conversation, but explicitly like not being a speaker, a participant in that conversation. Which is that it's generally my experience that if you're in a conversation, so like, so I was talking with no, I can't quite, let me see, hang on. There's something where if you're in a conversation and somebody kind of says something that you see as being false or confused or misleading, or sort of um, uh, uh, people talk about like a dangerous thought, and I don't mostly mean in the kind of political sense, but even just like if somebody thinks, for instance, that combining ammonia and bleach is a good idea. Like I think that's one of the 2 household chemicals that, like, if you combine them, you get a chemical reaction and can die. Like, that's a dangerous thought, right? Like a suggestion that someone could make. So if you're in a conversation, you're kind of if somebody says something and you don't kind of comment like, hey, no, that's a bad idea, or that's not true, or that's bullshit of some kind, there can be there's a way in which you're kind of implicitly agreeing with the thing, or you're at least kind of saying that it's sort of a reasonable or appropriate or sort of fine thing to sort of be unquestioned on the record. Where on the record I don't even mean the recording, I just mean in the record of everybody who's there in the conversation. If you're fishbowling or you're listening to a recording, you didn't have the chance to interrupt, and so by not interrupting, which you didn't have the chance to do, you're not actually sort of signing off on anything. And so that can be really powerful as well if you're dealing with people with different models or frames, is to, yeah, when there's a recording or a live fish bowling, to have the chance for people to have their experience of dissonance and maybe write it in a journal or something like that, but the conversation gets to flow without that dissonance being immediately brought in. And that can be cool. Like, I've done a bunch of fish bowling, particularly like last summer and fall, when I was differentiating myself more from the rest of the group. I did a bunch of fish bowling, and this is where I noticed this. I was like, oh, like, yeah, if they were having this conversation and I was in it, like, if I would have to be interrupting here, because I think that this is profoundly naive. But because I'm not in the conversation, I don't have to, because I can't in a certain sense, interrupt. And so I can just sit there and go, oh, well, how are they making sense of this? And it allowed space for more curiosity on my part. Yeah, because I wasn't sort of having to sign off on things I didn't agree with by implicitly being part of the conversation. There's other ways you can do that, of course. And even the word of course is related to that, which is if you're the way that things get languaged strongly affects what people feel they're signing off on by listening and sort of allowing a statement to stand. Like, you know, if I say I feel like tense right now, like that doesn't mean you feel tense right now. But if I say, oh, the air is in the room is a little tense right now, like if you don't kind of say anything, you're sort of just letting that stand as like what the air in the room is like, you know, in some more kind of collective sense. So I think, you know, it's worth practicing language that allows for a lot of space between different people's experiences and so on. And to some extent, you can do this kind of even if somebody's phrasing something in a way that feels like it's sort of making an objective claim, and you're like, well, I think that's more of a subjective thing that you're just saying about your own experience. But it is actually also important to be able to be sort of shared reality, what is shared reality, and not reify it all as only my experience. It's like, no, we're all having this experience right now. That's how I see it, right? Do you guys all see it like that? Yeah, cool. All right, cool. We're on the same page. And that's like part of where the coherence comes from. This is helpful. This is like, I've said a lot of this before, but this last piece is clicking with something else I'd just been recently thinking about. And so it's coming into greater clarity for me, which is like, which is about this piece of like basically connecting the frame dialogue thing, which has sort of been a handle that I've been working with for like dialoguing between different frames, and then this fishbowling thing, which I'd also been thinking about for a while. I hadn't quite connected those before, and like the importance of having people be able to use personal subjective language when that's appropriate, but also to be able to use, like, if you know, if I were to say right now, as far as I can tell, we're talking in English, like that would sort of be a weird statement, because like I kind of expect you to know that as well. And so like, why am I like highlighting the only I know this, like I'm only speaking for myself here? You might think we're speaking like, what? Like that should be common knowledge, right? So I should be saying, of course we're talking in English right now, and thus blah 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 blah. Like I can just state that as a premise that we should both know. And if you're like, wait, actually no, I think we're, you know, talking in Pig Latin or something, then, you know, you can say eight way earway akingte in a igpe atenle, and then I'd be like, well, we weren't though, right? Anyway, so yeah.
I remember the other question that I wanted to ask was sort of just, you know, back when I first heard about this, was a very practical question, because I was curious about implementing it myself. And it was sort of about how to do this technically. And you touched on, oh, we share it in Google Drive, and there's sort of different folders that we use for different permissions or groups for different privacy settings. Did you use any other kind of conventions or best practices for like organizing the files or naming them or anything like that?
Yeah. You know, just very in brief, we had a practice of year, month, day naming, which is the correct date structure, because it sorts. But we early on had a convention of 2-year two-digit dates, which is, from a long-term archival perspective, such a terrible idea. But the reality was, in the short term, those additional 2 characters of content that you could see of like the actual name of the recording on tiny smartphones was just worth it. And it's like, it's gonna be a long time before the dates tick over, and by that time, you know, manually renaming all of these recordings to have a 20 in front of them will be easy. So we kind of bit that bullet and went with the 2-digit date names. Then follows the kind of initials of the people in the conversation. So that would sort of, sometimes you could just put single letters. Sometimes you would have to put, like the first couple letters of somebody's name. Like, so if I were, naming this recording between you and I, it might be like, 210906 space Mal Tass um, podcast episode non-naive trust dance and recordings or something. And but if your name was yeah, and then people who would sort of be talked to a lot or like common patterns would get shortened a bit, so you'd have just initials, but that only works when it's unambiguous. Yeah.
So it was sort of dates and then names or initials and then content of the recording, like what the topic or theme was.
Yeah, pretty much. And we sometimes we had a couple of different emoji that we used for things, like stars indicating just like this is a really important recording, or just like a check mark to indicate a check-in. Like,
yeah, fascinating.
We didn't get we tried having a few more, but those were the main ones that sort of stuck. Like we tried having ones that would differentiate sort of the theory and the practice of the thing. Like, oh, we talked about really cool stuff here versus like we did a bunch of great work like on somebody's own issues or mindset or whatever.
Totally.